We're in the company of Robert Parsons here in the studio in Paris. Joining us from Uppsala in Sweden, Rouzbeh Parsi, head of the Middle East program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What can we piece together from public pronouncements and the like regarding an eventual role by Iran?
Well, I would be somewhat skeptical to the Wall Street Journal report. I think obviously Iran has, as you mentioned, a documented long-standing support for Hamas. The relationship has gone up and down over time, but it's definitely there, and that support exists. But that does not directly mean that there is an operational control or influence as to what Hamas does at any given point in time. So I think in this case, I would like to see something more concrete and tangible before I would believe that that connection exists.
Of course, there's another possibility, which is that they supported them actively, but succeeded perhaps too much for Tehran's taste. After all, what we're now going to see is a long war ahead.
Absolutely. And I mean, in any case, it is clear that most often the Iranians are interested in fomenting what they can foment against Israel and vice versa. But they do not want to become a direct party to that kind of conflict because it would inflict too much cost on them. So in that sense, at the moment, they are, if you will, at their sweet spot. There is a conflagration. It is very bloody. Israel is hurting, and that is to Iran's advantage. But they don't necessarily want this to escalate any further because then there is the risk that they would be dragged in directly.
Rouzbeh Parsi, it's not happening in a vacuum. Recently, there was these back-channel talks, some of them perhaps direct, between the U.S. and Iran regarding the unfreezing of Iranian oil money. Now, what happens next? What with a U.S. aircraft carrier en route to the region? The price of oil that's been spiking since Saturday?
Well, I think obviously those kind of conversations are much more difficult to have. They weren't easy to have to begin with, both because of how they were done, as in where they stood, but also because politically it was controversial, both in Washington and in Tehran. So in that sense, I think those are probably going to be on hold, especially if there is any inkling that Iran was more directly involved, because that would basically kill those conversations as far as the Americans are concerned. But I think it's also important to remember that what is happening right now isn't something that Iran, even if they wanted to, could have instigated on their own. I mean, in the end, this is about the occupation, and that is the main reason why Hamas exists. So in that sense, they have a lot of agency in what they do and don't do.
Robert Parsons?
Yeah, I mean, that makes absolute sense to me, except that clearly Iran over the years has been providing weaponry to Hamas and others. But to suggest that Iran is directly involved seems to me at this stage, without stronger evidence, a little bit far-fetched. Israel denying it. Possibly, you know, Iran is interested in destabilizing the gradual process of normalization and relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But not at all clear that it would achieve that through these methods, unless Israel, and this is the dilemma Israel faces now, of course, decides to take really strong measures against Hamas in Gaza. If Israel decides to start a ground offensive against Gaza, you know, all bets are off about what could happen next. It would certainly risk antagonizing the entire Arab world. So I would question whether at this stage Israel is prepared to go that far.
Does this, Rouzbeh Parsi, put on hold or scuttle completely that strategy that's been put forth by Washington under both Donald Trump and Joe Biden of warming relations with neighboring states, particularly Saudi Arabia at this point?
Well, as was mentioned just now, I think it has a lot to do with exactly how the Israelis are going to exact their retribution. If it becomes much bloodier than it already is, and if there is a ground offensive, then the question is, how will that sway Arab opinion? And even though Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman can do as he wants, more or less, he has to take those things into account. And the fact that part of his own political elite isn't necessarily very enthusiastic about getting closer to Israel. So in that sense, I think that conversation that the Biden administration has been pursuing with Israel and Saudi Arabia is probably also in danger, though it is not totally derailed. But for now, at least, I think it would be very difficult to sell that to the public.
There's one player in this that we haven't brought up yet, and that is the other big benefactor of Hamas, Qatar. What role for Qatar in the buildup, and what role going forward?
Well, Qatar is not the same kind of player as Iran is. Qatar is not involved in anything that remotely looks military. They have been trying to build their diplomatic prestige and their diplomatic ability in the last couple of years. So they have definitely connections to Hamas, but I don't see them as being in any way invested or interested in what is happening. Of course, they have been more critical of Israel, and they've also said that this is at least partly, if not wholly, Israeli responsibility because of the occupation. But they are definitely not interested in that this conflict is in any way deepened, for the simple reason that their primary ally in the long run is the United States, and that would put them in a conflicting course with them.
Rouzbeh Parsi, before we let you go, there's of course a domestic politics angle for this for Iranians. Sunday evening, Tehran's Azadi Stadium, there's a match between Persepolis and Golgahar, where one side brandishes a Palestinian flag and the other tells them to shove their flag you know where. What's your reaction to that video that's gone viral?
Well, I mean, you have to, as you said, this is domestic politics. The Palestinian issue is relevant for some people in Iran, but for a lot of people, it is nowadays primarily associated with the way the Iranian government pursues its foreign policy and, as many think, neglects its own population. So it's not necessarily that much about the Palestinians as much as people are basically fed up with this revolutionary rhetoric of Iran, basically helping people all over the place, but not doing much for the country itself.
Rouzbeh Parsi, many thanks for joining us from Uppsala, Sweden.
Thank you.